Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 3 of the Historians Lounge. I am your host, Gabriel Garcia, the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill. Joining me is a guest whom you probably have heard on this show before, but never seen. Joining us today is a returning guest, Heather Downing. Heather Downing is a military historian whom you may have remembered who was featured on my podcast in Historian's interview, where she talked about her studies and her theses and future projects coming up. And today in this episode, she and I will be discussing resistance during World War II and the interpretation and romanticization of resistance during World War II. Heather, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. So, Heather, you have studied resistance history in your fields of expertise, and in your studies of resistance, what have you sort of like found interesting or kind of broken the myth of resistance during World War II? Because we tend to have, in the more broad sense, the resistance being a very noble thing, but from a different perspective, it's not generally seen so.
I think there's a few different ways to kind of look at that question. There's the different types of resistance, then on top of that, depending upon what type of resistance we're looking at, there's how that was interpreted at the time. If we're looking at armed resistance, like we spoke about last time, an armed resistance group in a certain area can be doing something noble and something that they have to do to survive or to save others, but to people that may not be with the group and are kind of caught in the middle, they could view that group as less than noble, or in some situations as terrorists. It all just depends on which lens we're looking at it through, really.
Definitely, yeah. And I definitely feel, especially if you're talking about resisting during World War II, definitely the main resistance that comes to mind is, of course, the French resistance. That's probably the most iconic one. But I definitely feel there's not a lot of talk given to, the Dutch resistance or the other resistance around um, World War II. Why do you think it's sort of like the French resistance that kind of gets like this stamp of like the iconic imagery of resistance when resistance, specifically during World War II, was geographical, depending on the region?
I think it seems as though the French resistance there has gotten more notoriety simply because there's more record of it as far as like visual record. There's much more photograph and video and archives and things that people can see and put kind of two and two together. Whereas in other areas, like on the Eastern Front, that's really not so much the case. There's very little visual documentation of it. While there is some, it's just not nearly as substantial as the visual documentation in the French resistance.
Yeah, I definitely have to agree. The French Resistance has a lot more documentation. We have a lot more stories about the French Resistance. And actually, almost going back to what you said before, depending on how you interpret resistance, you could be like the freedom fighters, or you could also be seen as a terrorist. And I definitely think what really highlighted that discussion, going back to the interview, was talk of the brothers who were in Defiance, which, for listeners, just to recap, that movie followed up three brothers who rescued a bunch of people from their community and the surrounding communities, and they survived the war in the forest and traveling to and fro. And in the film, we see them as sort of like they are the protectors, they are like the main heroes of their story, but there's a different perspective or a perspective that's not really talked about. And Heather, you actually have some experience in this, having the opportunity to meet one of the brothers and learn from that side. So could you refresh us on what you learned about resistance from that perspective?
Yeah, for sure. So in the Defiance movie, people are most familiar with the three oldest brothers, but again, there was four brothers that were in the forest. The youngest being just a preteen when he entered the forest, whereas his other brothers were grown men at that time. So I think since they were more leadership positions, people are more familiar with them if they're familiar with the group at all. But when I was interviewing him about just the shifts and norms in the forest at the time, he one of the first things he said to me was, "We weren't terrorists. People think we were terrorists because in Eastern Poland at the time, which is actually the area is now Belarusia, but it was considered White Russia at the time, the occupying forces were welcomed a bit more in that area as far as the local population in comparison to where you would see situations with the French resistance. And so, well, not everyone was a collaborator. I'm not saying that at all. A lot of people were either neutral collaborators or they did collaborate with the occupying forces. And so when you have a population like that and you're trying to exist within it, you have less people that are willing to be defensive helpers, helping aid with food or clothing or weapons. And so, therefore, a lot of things had to be done by force for the greater good of the group. So, in order to get food at times, they're taking it by force or guns or retribution for those who had informed on the group and caused casualties within the group. And
Hmm.
so, to people in the surrounding towns around the Nalbuki Forest, many of the Polish citizens remember them as terrorists because they were, stealing or taking things by force. And so, therefore, their interpretation of the group is very different than those within the group who were saved by them. And so, it's just really interesting to see how that really plays out depending upon where you are, because you saw that much more often on the Eastern Front than you did in France. I mean, there was some that may view, the resistance as terrorists or antagonists, but for the most part, people were much more supportive in France than they were in Poland at the time.
That's actually very interesting. So, yeah, actually, going to lead into that. So, when we think of like particularly the French Resistance, a lot more people are more willing to help the French Resistance, whereas in the more Eastern Bloc countries, it's kind of like a very hesitance, a leniency to help out with resistance. And do you think, based on your own experience and your own studies, that may be in part due to the geography and the terrain of where these resistance held, where in the French resistance, it's more of like a city, urban population, whereas in the Eastern Bloc countries, it's more a rural, kind of very local region?
I think that definitely could be a contributing factor. I mean, you in Warsaw was a city, and in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which is different than the Warsaw Uprising, you saw still people not as willing to support or defend Jewish resistance, whereas they would support and defend, the Polish Home Army or their fellow countrymen. So it really depended upon who you were as a resistance group,
Mm-hmm.
as to whether or not you were supported. That comes much more into play on the Eastern Front than it did in France because anti Semitism was much stronger on the Eastern Front than it was in France.
Yes, yeah. It is very interesting having this discussion about the history of resistance in World War II and this big discussion, because generally, for someone who has no knowledge of the resistance, we would solely just think of like the French resistance and the Marquis resistance. But resistance can not just solely be, armed resistance. It could also be resistance in like rescuing people. And I know what you sent to me a while ago was on one of the most famous resistance fighters was I think his name was, correct if I'm wrong, Marseille Marceau, the famous mime. Well, he became a mime performer, but he was a huge resistance fighter in France. And I don't think people know who Marseille Marceau is. Can you give us a little detail from your research of who Marseille Marceau is and why he should be acknowledged as a contributor to resistance?
Well, my specialty is definitely much more on the Eastern Front. But As far as why people should know who he is, I think people should know who a lot of these resistance groups and fighters were, but they don't get the notoriety because they weren't military members, so
Mm,
the records are different. You don't receive an award or a pin or a medal always when
right.
you're in a resistance group. And so I think there's quite a few people, even within the French resistance, within all the resistance groups, that are important that we didn't see. That you really have to dig deep in history or find someone who that's their specialty to even learn about, which I think is so unfortunate because people can rattle off so many military members, and that's fantastic. But we tend to miss or forget the armed resistance groups or leaders who worked alongside with the military, coordinating with them,
Right.
gathering intel, doing so many things for the military, but very much in the shadows and on their own with, little to no backup. And so I think men like that and women like that are so brave. But I wanted to add on something
Of
we
course.
had spoken about a minute ago. One big difference on the French resistance, the kind of the culture around it versus on the Eastern Front is that you didn't see during the war um, as much support on the Eastern Front. There was obviously some, but not quite as supported and welcome as on in France. Whereas the
Mm,
difference is, there was more people that could either be bystanders or collaborators on the Eastern Front, and it was not something people had to worry about being in trouble for amongst their neighbors if they were a collaborator. Whereas in France, you saw after liberation the ugly carnivals, the women that were marched down the
oh,
roads, that
yes.
anyone that they had found out was collaborating with the occupiers, there was a harsh penalty to pay for them. Whereas in
Mhm.
Poland, you didn't see things like that happening because collaboration was much more welcomed. So it just depended upon who you are and where you are as to how your experience was going to be as far as resistance and collaboration, really.
Yes, definitely. I'm actually glad you actually brought that up because I remember you said the parades, the women parades in France, especially if anyone remembers Band of Brothers, there's actually a big scene where some of the women with the shaved heads and being dragged through the streets. That leaves a image memory in your mind that you can't forget, which is often very fascinating because yeah, we see that in the French resistance culture and depictions and the records, but yes, as you said, we don't really see that much on the eastern side and the eastern resistance, which is really, really interesting. And that actually brings up another discussion of like the culture between the two, the French resistance and the eastern resistance. Um, what other details or myths you think have been like shed about the Eastern Resistance that really is not true or is like a big blow out of proportion? I think one that I was actually reading, and maybe you can actually correct me or not, that unlike in the French resistance and the Eastern resistance side, there's a lot more violence or there's a lot more harsh in terms of like survival. I don't know if that's true or not, but that was something that did pop up in my own studies or research. So can you provide some more insight into like the livability of like resistance for people who joined in?
So, no matter where they were located, there was obviously a lot of dangers that were going to be equal whether you were in France or on the Eastern Front. Because at any time, someone could, inform on you or your family could be in danger. But as far as survival and daily needs, the French resistance, they operated in a very different way than many of the Eastern Front resistance groups did. You saw in again, this kind of ties in with the collaboration. People could go home to their families every night and many times in the French resistance, whereas on the Eastern Front, it was too dangerous. When you joined the resistance, you left home and you did not really come back. because you were always out fighting, you were staying with your group, you were living in the forest or creating different headquarters and moving all around. Whereas in the French resistance, it, I guess, logistically was just very different. And so survival on the Eastern Front, you had to survive the weather, the harsh
Hmm.
conditions of just winter, no matter who you were. I mean, you aren't going home each night and having supper cooked for you. You're going into the forest or you're going into a hiding place. It's just a very different situation.
Definitely. And one thing I actually did want to talk about is in a lot of the depictions of the French resistance we see in like in films and like movies, we always tend to see the Allies, particularly the British and the Americans, giving arms and supplies to the resistance in France to fight back. But to my knowledge, there doesn't seem to be that kind of same uh give not give but like leasing to the Eastern resistance. Why do you typically think the in your research that the resistance fighters in like Poland and the Eastern countries did not get a lot of aid from the Allies, where the French resistance, some of those groups probably did get military aid?
So I think when it comes to the Eastern Front, it depends on who you are as a resistance group. The Polish Home Army did receive, I would say, the most support, to my knowledge, from the Allies as far as the British and the Americans. But if you're looking at a Jewish resistance group, they, like the Belskio Triad, they had to kind of enter into a marriage of convenience with the Soviet partisans who were
Hmm.
communicating with the Red Army, and they did receive some support from the Soviets. I mean, again, because they're also right there. But
Right.
so there were, I know with the Belskis, there was an airstrip that they and other partisans in the area had created, and they had to help guard it in rotations of guard duty. And certain
Hmm.
things would get dropped, and every once in a while, someone, if they were injured, could get airlifted out, which was pretty rare, but did happen. But they didn't usually receive arms. It might be radios or,
Mm.
information as far as propaganda that's being told so they can be prepared for it, or
Right.
movements or things like that, but not usually arms, especially if you were in a Jewish resistance group. Oftentimes you had to fight other resistance groups just to keep them from taking your weapons from you. So there's a lot of, I kind of feel like it's a war within a war when you're looking at certain resistance groups on the Eastern Front, and it just depended on who you were as to who you were fighting. Everyone might have been fighting, the Nazis or the Germans, but some of the resistance groups were fighting each other. They weren't necessarily working together.
That's actually that's another thing I actually want to ask you about, because when we think of resistance in World War II, we think of like this unity, this giant coalition fighting against like the Nazi Germans. But as you said, especially in Eastern resistance, it's kind of like I said, a war within a war, where you have the resistance groups fighting against the Nazis, but also kind of like fighting amongst the other resistance just to stay alive for like the limited resources that there was. So besides the Bilecki brothers, what other resistance groups in Poland or in other Eastern Bloc countries have you like found or research that have been interesting and kind of obscure?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, so Faye Schulman, she was Jewish, but she concealed her Jewish identity, and she was in a Soviet partisan group, not a Jewish resistance group. It was called the Molotov Brigade, and they coordinated with the Red Army. And so it's fascinating to see her photo documentation of the years in the forest, and she documented so many different things. So just following her photographs as far as looking at resistance on the Eastern Front is fascinating. You see images of surgery being done in the forest, of funerals and caskets and partisans of all different kinds being buried together at times. And then you also see times when people are not so much enjoying themselves, but she talks in her memoirs about how they were able to enjoy a, warm day in the summertime, and there wasn't
Mm.
fighting that day, or getting to go on a mission that brought them back to where they had previously lived and somewhere they hadn't been for quite a while, and then what that experience was like for any type of partisan, and seeing, what the occupying forces have done to your home or your town or whatever it may be. But she is a fascinating woman to read about, and the Molotov Brigade is also it's a very interesting group to read about.
That's actually really fascinating. I've never heard about on this group. And I also keep noticing the word a partisan. Now, for listeners who may be unfamiliar with that term, the partisans, what does that mean during the context of World War II and resistance?
So when I introduced or interviewed the youngest Bilski brother, I had asked him about that. Was this a term that they used to refer to themselves at the time, or is it a term that, historians or authors have kind of placed on them? And he said it was at some point later in the war that it was the first time
Mm.
that he and his brothers had heard the term, and they didn't know what it meant. And they just were kind of fascinated by, okay, there's a term for this now. It's almost like you've been at it for so long now that there was certain terminology that came up with it, but it was more just at the time you were an armed resistance fighter, and eventually it became the term partisan. Now, partisan only referred to armed resistance fighters. It wasn't someone who was participating in symbolic resistance or defensive resistance. It was someone who was actively participating in armed resistance.
Ah, fascinating. That's actually really cool. Pardon me. So, besides that famous woman photographer with the Russian group, what other obscure resistance groups have you sort of uncovered or learned about in your studies um, recently?
So this isn't an example of armed resistance, but as far as intellectual resistance, or there, I would say maybe it falls under symbolic as well, but the White Rose Resistance, which maybe some
Mm.
people have heard of, it was five college students and one professor. They were located in Germany, and they would create these leaflets or pamphlets educating the people around them, this is what's really happening outside of Germany, trying to rally their fellow countrymen in Germany to open their eyes and see what was really happening. And even though these individuals were not a targeted group, they were standing up for what they knew was right, and they were trying to educate people. um, of the students, three of them were related, and a brother and sister were executed by the Germans during the war. And it's just, to me, it's fascinating to see how different people interpret what resistance looks like to them. What can they do? And so there's the White Rose Resistance. Then inside the Warsaw Ghetto, Emanuel Ringelblum, he came up with the idea that they should document everything that is happening in the ghetto, everything that happened to people before they came there. And so you can see it now. You can go online and view some parts of it, or you can travel to the museums. But the Oneg Shabbat, or the Ringelblum Archive, it has so many different things. It's so interesting. Again, not it was an example of armed resistance, but it was documentation. And they collected everything, stories from people that were first entering the ghetto, the labels from the soup cans and the soup kitchens, propaganda posters
Mm.
that were inside the ghetto, all sorts of things, such as the daily calorie intake as it dwindled down, who disappeared, what they were, experiencing, and they would document it and collect it all, and then they would bury it. And
Wow.
the majority of what was buried has been found, but not all of it. They constructed these special containers and they would bury it, but then Warsaw Ghetto was razed to the ground. So
Hmm.
remembering, very few people that were in the group survived, I think less than a handful. And then on top of that, not everyone knew where everything was, but also it's no longer the ghetto, it's just a giant pile of bricks. So trying to find where certain buildings were, it took a very long time. And surprisingly, the majority of what was buried that they found did survive and was intact and was not ruined because they did such a
Wow.
good job of preserving it in the way that they buried it. It's really fascinating. And so he was Emmanuel Ringelblum, he was a historian, and so he was like a resistance historian. He said, "This is what I know how to do best, and this is how I can resist by making sure that the people of tomorrow that find this know what happened here so that, maybe it doesn't happen again or people can really know what happened because they didn't know how the war was going to
Mhm.
turn out." So that's also, I think, really fascinating.
That is actually really fascinating. I've never heard of any of these people, and I think it is important to learn about them, to study them, and to honor them and place them in the pantheon of resistance leaders and people during this time period. And it shows resistance came in a variety of forms, from armed resistance, from theological resistance, symbolic resistance, religious resistance. There's a lot. But I think we can also agree that being a resistance fighter or individual came with a lot of dangers, especially depending on who you were and what group you were part of. You were either found by collaborators or co-conspirators, probably executed. If you were Jewish, more than likely you were probably taken to one of the concentration camps. There was a lot of dangers um, that impacted a lot of these people. And I definitely think when we tend to romanticize resistance, we tend not to think of like all these people as like they died for the cause, the grand scheme of things. Well, and by grand scheme of things, I mean the end of the war. For them, that may be true, but for others, I think their grand scheme of things was getting the occupying force out of their country. To them, that was their end goals, and I don't think we really consider that. And also, what we talked about in the interview a long time ago, which is, being a resistance fighter, we tend to have this notion of, oh, I would love to have been a resistance fighter. So it's like, probably not, because you would have to sacrifice a lot. You probably may not see your family, probably be separated from your family. There's a high probability you probably may die either by the elements or by your enemy. You probably not get the best food or the best clothes. You'll have to move around from place to place. It's not a very it's not something that people choose to go into. Well, maybe some, depending on if they do choose, or sometimes that choice is forced upon them. Ultimately, what I'm trying to get at is, why do you think now in the 21st century we romanticize the resistance fighters from both the Eastern Front resistance and the French resistance, even though historically it was a very dangerous time to be a resistance fighter?
I think as far as certain generations at this point today, in a way, we're so far removed from the Second World War that, you and I, we didn't experience it. Our
Right.
parents didn't, at our age, our parents are not old enough to have experienced it, and maybe not grandparents. And if they did, they might have been young, but we don't have the memories and the trauma of
Mm-mm.
experiencing that. And so therefore we look at the resistance fighters and we see like, yeah, they're fighting the good fight. They're going against the enemy, but that's because we're not fully placing it in the same context that someone at the time would be placing that
Mm-mm.
decision. There's a lot more emotion for them, a lot more real life danger, whether it's for them or their family, that we can apply that while trying to think about it, but we don't have that emotional feeling while thinking about what we would do that people of older generations do or did. And so I think for us, it's easier to just look at the bravery of it and say, "Oh yeah, I would do that." We don't know what we would do because we're not. We don't have the full picture that those people had.
Yeah, I completely agree. And yeah, we are so far away from World War II. I mean, we're constantly seeing new documentaries being unfolded about World War II, some lost histories, which I think is important. But still, it's so far away from us is that we can see it from an outsider's perspective, someone who's never uh, embarked in that time period, or at least have family members who were part of the war, either actively involved in it or grew up during that time period. We can never truly understand what life was like for the people on all sides, especially. And I remember we did talk about this in the interview, which is when we tried to imagine ourselves as, would we be a resistance fighter? It's like, yeah, we would probably be a resistance fighter, but would you? If you as yourself was in 1930s Poland or 1930s France, would you have been a resistance fighter? Okay, let's play for the argument says you were. You probably most likely would not be like maybe the gung ho armed resistance, because that's a very, very dangerous thing. Resistance itself at that time was dangerous. Armed resistance had a bigger target on your back. You could resist in different ways, from getting people out of France if you were like um, extracting Jewish families or Jewish children out of the country and into Great Britain or the United States. That's one form of resistance. Intellectual resistance, calling out against the propaganda. Or if you were armed resistance, it's very dangerous. And I don't think people, again, really contextualize, would you actually be a resistance fighter? Or if you were, it would not be, the glory, the sunshine, or like the bravado. It's a very, very serious, dangerous thing, because I'm pretty sure a lot of people who were part of those resistance groups realized they could die like that. Their life could be gone, just like that. And in your interview with one of the Belensky brothers, did they talk about, did they ever expect to live as long as they did in their time of resistance against the Germans?
So, to touch back on one thing real quick, I think another reason why it's harder for us to contextualize is that we're located
Mm.
in America. You
Yes.
know, none of these armed resistance movements none of this occurred on American soil.
Yes.
Yes, there was Pearl Harbor, but the majority of World War II, I mean, 99.999% of it was not fought here. So we don't
Mm-mm.
see the destruction. You can research it or you can go travel. And yes, some people, their grandparents have moved here since then and they have a grandparent that may have survived it or been a resistance fighter, but we ourselves, we we didn't even grow up in an area where we would see that,
Mm-mm.
and we don't live, most of us live even in a climate that's remotely close to that of Eastern Europe in the winter. I mean, some people in northern United States, yes, but I'm in Florida, so it's a lot easier for me to think, "Oh, yeah, staying outside in the wintertime, it might get cold," but that's nothing compared to
Mm-mm.
a winter outside or 4 winters outside in Eastern Europe. I mean,
Right.
totally, totally different level of commitment that you're having to factor in, and when you don't live in that, I think it doesn't even occur to a lot of people, because someone who grew up in Florida, that's not going to occur to them, that they have to not just battle the enemy, but they have to battle the climate just to survive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is true. Like, we think of like the winter, like it said, especially for California, it doesn't get snow here. I mean, it gets cold. That's nothing compared to the cold in Poland, or if we're talking like the snow in Stalingrad. I mean, that is deathly cold. That is like a blizzard cold. But yet these people found a way to survive in both the elements and at a time of war, and somehow they survive, even sometimes with limited resources, limited ammunition, limited food. They had to be very, very scarce. And it is very, very fascinating to see, even if like in like media or books or in documentaries, you get a sense of, well, actually, this is something I did want to talk with you about, especially in terms of like media. When we see resistance in media, especially when it comes to the French resistance, people get this different feeling. Especially I've noticed when we see the French resistance, it's kind of like this more kind of like positive, gung ho kind of feeling. Now, if you look at more of the Eastern Front resistance and you see the evidence that is found, people living in the forests, the conditions, you get that different sense, the sense of like dread, the sense of like grueling nature. Both were grueling and both were very dangerous, but yet from the Eastern Front resistance, it's vastly different in terms of like the emotions that you feel. Do you kind of feel that that's purposeful in terms of like, the imagery that we do get, the documentation we do get, that it's kind of like a different feeling when you look at these pictures?
Oh, for sure. I have in my office a picture of two French resistance fighters, and just the level of personal style amongst the fighters. Women are wearing, they're very well put together, they're very clean, they're stylish for the times, and they're able to because of the difference in the situation. Whereas for the majority of resistance fighters on the Eastern Front, they some of them had been wearing the same outfit for 2 years, and they're just hoping to keep it in one piece until the war
Right.
ends. It's just very it's two very different pictures, and I think people tend to also kind of gravitate towards something they find more relatable. So it's easier to relate to someone who is a little bit more like you as far as being put together still or being fashionable or whatever it may be. There's just a huge difference in the imagery of the
Hmm.
actuality of the situation. And I think that also plays into what makes certain things seem more relatable and the other ones seem harder to kind of wrap your head around.
Definitely. And I also definitely think when we going back to like the imagery discussion, when we see, these French resistance fighters, and yes, they're very, very put together, they're very clean, they're very well groomed, they have their patches, they have their insignia of what resistance they're part of. We tend to have the notion like, yes, this is the quintessential resistance fighter. But I think if you look at more of like the Eastern Front resistance, that to me generally represents what the like a general true resistance fighter, because these weren't people that had like insignias or clans or groups. These were just common men, women, even children
Hmm.
fighting just to survive. And I definitely think when we look at resistance in terms of like imagery and clothing, we tend to go to the French resistance. And in my opinion, I feel we tend to gravitate towards them because we like to think that resistance was very uniformed, this very like clean cut, narrow, very organized, symbolic thing. But as the Eastern Front, it's very raw, it's up close, there's no gravitas, it's not pretty. This is the realest sense. And I think that makes people uncomfortable, but it's important to feel uncomfortable because it does kind of break the myth that the resistance is very romanticized, because the Eastern Front resistance, it's not. There's nothing to romanticize about it. It wasn't like these men and women were not doing this for a sense of glory. These people were just trying to get these occupiers out of their country and to try to go back to some normalcy in their lives, which I think is another thing we don't talk about in the history of resistance, is returning to that sense of normalcy, of going back to the lives before the war, which I can't even imagine what that must be like. And again, that goes back to what we said, living in the United States, we can't even remotely understand that sense of being in war, fighting, and trying to go back to a sense of normalcy. Maybe some people did it better than others. Maybe some didn't. We don't know. But I think what we can agree on, we will never truly understand that sense of trying to go back to who we were when you have changed. What are your thoughts on that?
For many people on the Eastern Front, whether they were Jewish partisans, Polish partisans, Soviet partisans, a lot of them, the fighting on the Eastern Front was just, it was so bloody. I mean, it was everywhere, but the Eastern Front was just a pile of rubble for the most part when the
Hmm.
war ended. And so many of these people that I've either interviewed or listened to their testimony or read their memoirs, they talk about when they finally made it back to their town either didn't exist, everything had just been leveled, or their home was gone, their business was gone, there was no one left that they knew. And so how do you go back to that? You can't.
Hmm.
So
No.
many people couldn't go. They went and there was nowhere to go, so they'd have to go somewhere else, or they immigrated, or they, just depends on who they are. But for so many people there was no normalcy to go back
No.
to. It was creating a new normal. And especially depending upon who you were, depended upon if you could ever feel like you could be a citizen of that country anymore. In France, if you were Jewish, it would probably be much easier to trust your countrymen than if you were Jewish in Poland.
Hmm.
It's just so many different things to take into consideration. And it also depended on what you did. Like we were talking a moment ago again about uniforms and clothing. In Germany, there was this resistance movement of teenagers that they typically were supposed to, at that age, join the Hitler Youth, which was
Right.
divided up by male and females. But this group was male and female together, teenagers, and they were known as the Edelweiss Pirates. And
Mm.
they actually had uniforms of their own, and they mostly, it was like acts of provocation or just resisting by refusing to join. But they were much more organized in the fact that you could identify them. They had patches. They were
Hmm.
some highly organized teenagers, for one. But also they took pride in, their uniforms, their patches. But again, they were in Germany, which was, they were resisting for different reasons, but they also were resisting in different ways. And so it all depends on, again, who you are, where you are. And after the war, I think someone who had been part of that resistance in that area, it might be easier to return to some sense of normalcy. You're a teenager resisting against, being told you have to join this youth group, as opposed to a family in, Poland or Austria, or Slavic peoples whose their whole town was gone, or during the war they learned, how unwelcome they were from their
Hmm.
neighbors or whatever it is. And so there is no normalcy to return to, because the world was different after that for some people.
Yeah, that actually a scene that comes to my mind is that scene from Schindler's List where you have all the Jewish workers kind of in the middle, and you have that Russian tank coming in and saying you've all been liberated, the war is over, and you see their heads turning as it's like, where do we go? We go back there or do we go there? And we don't really consider that, like, how do you go back to a time when, there wasn't any war? I mean, it's kind of hard when you've seen some horrors, you've gone through horrors. It's like you can't, because you've changed, you've grown. And in a time of like now relative peace, it's like, where do you do, or what do you do, or where do you go? And again, guys, ties back to what we said before. We in the United States will probably never understand what that feels like, this sense of displacement and trying to figure out, who am I now? Where do I call home? And it is kind of tragic. And we're just nearing the end before we go into the closing segments. But what's probably your last few thoughts on this topic, Heather? Like, what is like the one thing you want to like really nail in the coffin for like the topic of resistance, either the history of it, the romanticization, or the myths surrounding resistance during this time period?
Um, I think it would be really interesting if people kind of step back and they look at how meaningful resistance was at the time and how something that may seem very small to someone right now was actually such a huge act for the person who did it at the time because of what it meant. And I think there's a lot of acts of resistance where people were just maintaining their sense of dignity or sense of self-respect at a time where that was all they had left. And so they might not have been armed resistance fighters, but the refusal to do certain things when you're in a camp or wherever you are, I think small and large acts of resistance were so brave, and people should really kind of look at that alongside military history as far as if you're looking at resisting the Nazi regime,
Hmm.
what that really means, all the different types of resistance and how important they all were.
That's actually wonderfully said and beautifully put. And I think that is probably like the perfect way to end this very, very wonderful discussion today. And before we officially end this great discussion, listeners, Heather, where can people find and engage with you and learn more about your projects and anything new you're working on?
I still say for now, LinkedIn, I haven't been very active, but it is really the only way to somewhat keep up with me. I've been very busy with finishing up my master's program, but I'm almost done with my last classes. And next month, then I begin my dissertation, which is actually, of course, on resistance, um,
Nice.
focusing on all the different resistance groups within the Nalaboki Forest, which was on the Eastern Front, and focusing on that war within a war, on the groups that collaborated with one another, the groups that fought one another, and yet they're all fighting these little wars within the main war that they're all fighting at the same time. So that's what I'm working on.
Awesome. Well, listeners, I hope you enjoyed episode 3 of the Historians Lounge. And I will make sure to post this on Anchor for you to listen to. Make sure to like this episode and subscribe to the channel if you want to see any more episodes. Again, I want to thank our guest, Heather, for joining us. And if you want to re-listen to the interview I had with Heather on my podcast, I'll also link that below. Again, Heather, thank you so much for joining us today and being part of this discussion.
Thank you.
Well, listeners, this has been the Historians Lounge episode 3, and I am your host, Gabriel Garcia, the Wandering Quill and the Wandering Scribe, signing out. Good day.